Hey folks, Tycoy Pinkston here. Let's talk about direct edition versus newsstand edition. So when I was a kid, I thought of it like this. Newsstand editions are the ones that you get from the grocery store or 7-Eleven. Direct editions, they came from specialty comic shops. For me, it was Four Colored Fantasy down in San Bernardino, California. Now, if you grew up collecting in the 90s, then you may be surprised with all of the hype right now about newsstand editions. I mean, when I was a kid, we all went for the direct edition. Newsstands were like garbage, okay? The image of Spider Man in the bottom corner was so much more cooler than an ugly old barcode. So, why are there newsstand and direct editions of comics, and how do we tell these apart? Newsstands generally paid a higher price for the comics, but they were willing to do so because if they didn't sell the copies that were sent to them, they could return the leftovers for a refund. Okay. So in practice, that wasn't really a great thing for Marvel because what ended up happening was that they would overprint the newsstand comics and then they would also have to pay for whatever wasn't sold to be shipped back to them. That was very inefficient and it wasted a lot of money that otherwise could have been profit. So when these comic book specialty stores started to open up and they gained in popularity, Marvel also sold directly to them. But they came up with this idea where they could change their selling model in order to address the problem with the waste. Okay. So Marvel sold directly to these shops at a discounted price. However, because of that discount, the books that were sent were non refundable. So, by setting up this policy, Marvel was able to better estimate how many books should be printed for the direct shops, and they didn't need to pay for any return shipping on the issues that didn't sell. But separating their customer base into direct and newsstands, it did come with a problem, right? Since some of these books were returnable and others were not, Marvel had to do something to differentiate them so that no one cheated the system.
So if you want to look at what that is, there's actually two different ways that you can tell whether or not a comic book is a direct edition or a newsstand. The first way is to look in the upper left-hand corner of the comic. Here you're looking right above that Smurf where it says 60 cents. You see how that's a square? That's actually what you see on a newsstand comic. The second way that you see this is the barcode that you see in the lower left-hand corner. Now let's take a look at this direct edition. The upper left-hand corner has a diamond, which is considered to be present in the direct editions. But when it comes to that barcode, there's a few different variations that Marvel went through to distinguish. The first one was having a slash through the barcode like this right here. But the aesthetics on that kind of sucked, so Marvel changed it up. The next step that they took was to put Spider-Man's mug in the lower right-hand corner where that UPC box is. But note that the diamond is present on both of these direct editions. Eventually, the diamond did change into an M, and that Spider-Man mug ended up turning into a black Spider-Man, like what you see here on Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Meanwhile, the newsstand editions kept the square look in the upper left-hand corner. Now, the one advantage newsstands had was that cool UPC code where they could scan the comics in. And that's something the direct market wanted on their comics as well. Eventually, both markets took on this look, but to this day, if you pull a comic off the shelf, you can still tell it is a direct or newsstand edition because in the box next to the barcode, it'll usually say direct edition, just like in this copy of Amazing Spider-Man number 5. The exception to the rule is that Marvel pretty much stopped shipping to the newsstand around 2013, so some of these comics don't even bother to indicate direct or newsstand variant. By the way, this isn't just with Marvel. Take a look at this copy of Veronica number 103, which is also a direct edition, as you can see in the box.
You got to admit, it is a fair question, right? Why does it matter? Well, the answer comes down to a very simple principle that permeates every collectible market known to mankind. It is all about scarcity, supply and demand. You see, when this change started, there were still so many more sales that were made through newsstands, and the number of books that were printed reflected that.
So check out this graphic I made from information presented by Solar Collector in a blog about this topic. In 1979, something like 92% of all comics sold in North America were sold on the newsstands, with about 8%, give or take a digit, being sold to the direct market. But continuing through the mid 80s, the comic specialty shops started to grow in popularity and the printing and distributing numbers started to reflect that. It was around 1985, 1986 or so that there was an estimated 50-50 split in the numbers. After that, well, these are the years when newsstand variants became really hard to find, with 30% of all printed books accounted for newsstand distribution in 1987, 15% in 1990, and 10% in 1995. It is much, much lower nowadays. In fact, Marvel stopped the whole newsstand sales back in 2013, and their comics are now purchased from the comic shop, not the 7-Eleven.
So, with all that said, the first reason newsstand matters is simply supply issues. Depending on the year, there were not many of them. That made them more rare and scarce. Another reason newsstand may be hotter is because they were fingered by so many nasty little children who are waiting for their parents to finish grocery shopping. So those books were on those wired turnstile racks. They were picked up and handled by window shoppers more so than the books in the specialty stores. So for that reason, it can be a lot more challenging to find newsstand editions in higher grade. And speaking of grade, let's have a look at a few of the newsstand and direct edition slabs and see how they differ on the effects with fair market value.
So here we have two copies of Transformers number one in direct edition and one in a newsstand. Although these books are both awesome and almost identical, that UPC code makes a very big difference in the fair market value of each book. In the direct edition, as of January 2021, Transformers number one, slabbed in a 9.8, has a fair market value of approximately $1,500, with the last noted sale on eBay being for about $1,200. Now, take a look at that newsstand variant. Go Collect Comics sets the fair market value of the same book in newsstand edition at $2,350, with the most recent sale on eBay being for $2,474. That is some difference, right? Unfortunately, CGC didn't really differentiate how many of the 3,200 plus copies of this book that have been graded were newsstand and how many were direct edition, though this is something that they are starting to pay more attention to now.
So I was collecting in the early 90s when Image Comics started. And if you think Marvel's numbers were crazy low for their newsstand editions at this time, we'll get this. Image distributed about 99% of their books through the direct market. Yeah. So those books were all insanely overprinted, I know, but not the newsstands. They were, in fact, quite hard to find, and that is why you're going to pay a premium for your 9.8 Spawn number one if it is a newsstand edition.
So here we have Darker Image number one, which, according to CGC, is the first appearance of the Max. Direct editions of this book are very common, and if your local comic shop has a dollar bin, you'll likely find this issue in it. But you are certainly scoring if you see the newsstand variant in there. These are the fair market values that Go Collect Comics is currently posting on this book. The direct edition in a 9.8 is currently moving for about 90 bucks, and you can see that 504 there. That shows how many copies of this book are on CGC Census. The newsstand edition only has 59 copies on Census, but the same 9.8 is moving for 375. Again, big difference. Remember in that graph how around 1986 distribution was about 50-50? Well, that's true, but today, a newsstand book from that year is certainly less common than a direct edition. Why? Well, remember, if it didn't sell on the newsstand, it was destroyed and returned to the publisher. Yes, I do mean destroyed. You see, Marvel only wanted proof that the book didn't sell before giving refunds, so instead of paying for the entire comic to be returned to them, newsstand owners would just rip off the covers and send those in. That kept shipping weight down, and it gave Marvel the proof they needed to issue the refund. Now, if the same book didn't sell in the comic shops, well, it went into the back issues and it remained in circulation. And that's a very important point to consider, because even though there were significantly more newsstand editions that were circulated, say in 1982, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are more newsstand editions from 1982 that exist today. The answer to which one is more common? I don't know. I don't know if anyone knows because the data out there to show how many were destroyed is just not there. So, given this information, my friends, if you are looking at two copies of the same book, one in newsstand, one in direct edition, you are approaching this purchase as some form of an investment, which one do you buy? Well, here's the gospel according to Taikoi. First and foremost, go for grade. From an investor's perspective, grade is everything. It's almost always better to get the nicer copy of a book. Now, in some rare cases, like in that Darker Image 1 book, a 9.6 newsstand might be worth more than a 9.8 direct edition, but the general rule is that 9.8s trump 9.6s just about every time, okay? So if you have an eye for spotting 9.8s, that's generally the best choice to make. Also, don't forget to check the page color. I once had two slab copies of She-Hulk 1 for sale. One was newsstand, one was direct edition, and they were both 9.4s. The direct edition had white pages and the newsstand had off-white to white pages. Now that book came from 1980, so one would infer that there are more newsstand copies out there than direct editions. Even if 50% of all newsstand copies were returned, that would probably be true. Now the fact that the direct edition had white page though makes it a better book in my opinion. In some other cases, though, having the off-white page might be a better choice if you consider the distro and destro data that we discussed in this video. Remember the years in which newsstand distributions were common versus rare, but also you need to weigh that with the understanding that a lot of those newsstand editions, even though they were distributed in greater numbers, were also destroyed if not sold, which could still be making them the rarer book. If a book is a newsstand, it might also be a nested variant. You're going to want to check the price of that book and the centerfold. If you're looking at a Canadian price variant, which was present only on newsstand editions of books during certain years in the early to mid 80s, then that is certainly going to be the best choice. In this case, I may even be willing to sacrifice some grade for the Canadian price variant. I said I might, okay? Also, check to see if it's a Mark Jewelers variant. That means it has an insert at the centerfold advertising jewelry for sale, which again appeared in newsstand editions after the cover distinction was made. Going into detail on Canadian price variants and Mark Jewelers is beyond the scope of this video, but it's certainly worth learning about if you're not familiar. So perhaps I'll do a video on that in the future, but until then, give it a Google. Always do your research too, guys, especially if you're choosing between a direct or newsstand variant with a high price book and if there is a price difference between them. When that's present, always take a look to see if the fair market value of both of them justifies paying a little bit more for that UPC. And lastly, my friends, know when it doesn't matter. For me personally, if a book doesn't look like it's going to hit a 9.8 or a 9.6, I generally don't even give much weight to this topic. Newsstand versus direct edition becomes a more important issue when you're talking about key books, first issues, first appearances, etc., and it is more important in higher grade. If you're looking at a filler book for your collection so that you can complete a run, or you're looking at something that is a bigger book but it's mid-grade, I wouldn't even really bother considering this that much when I make my purchase.
Guys, if you enjoyed this video and you got something useful out of it, please be sure to hit that like button, leave some comments below, and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, hit me up on my website if you want to check out some of the cool slabs that I have for sale at a killer deal. And given that I just made this video, you know I'm not about to overcharge you for a newsstand edition that you shouldn't be paying more for.